Hello and welcome to the fifth and final one of my Hero's Journey videos. So we've already talked about the ordinary world and call to adventure, the road of trials, the ordeal, the road back, and now we're going to talk about the ending of the hero's journey. So in the two different versions of the hero's journey that I've been looking at, The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell and The Writer's Journey by Christopher Volger, I think the ending is where they differ the most in kind of how they describe things. I mean, don't get me wrong, whichever one you go with, it's still the triumphant return stage, and there are a ton of similarities. But I do think that because Campbell was describing old myths, whereas Volger was describing current writing techniques, there's a bit of a difference here that we don't see elsewhere. I also think it's interesting that in a lot of stories, I've noticed that this often kind of gets smushed together with the ordeal, and we're going to talk about that as well. Just as a reminder, the examples that I have been using for this are The Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Star Wars, The Wizard of Oz, and The Hunger Games. Hopefully you're familiar with at least one of those and will be able to follow along. These all look very different though when it comes to how the hero's journey ends. And I think even though I've typically been looking at the first installments in series where there are multiple installments that each have their own hero's journey, I think it'll be more useful to actually look at the endings of the series, or at least the endings of certain parts of the series when we have something like Star Wars, for instance, that has multiple trilogies. But first, actually, I want to start with Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, because I think that's the most cut and dried example of this. So with Dorothy, the ordeal was facing off against the Wicked Witch of the West, and then the road back was returning to the Emerald City and finding out that the wizard can't send her home. Which takes us up to the moment where Glinda tells her that she has had what she needed to get home all along. She realizes the lesson that she's learned, and she looks down at the ruby slippers and she clicks her heels together and says, "There's no place like home, there's no place like home, there's no place like home." And that is what Christopher Volger describes as the resurrection stage. And it actually almost kind of looks like a literal resurrection, because when she gets back to Kansas, in the movie at least, she's lying in bed and they're taking care of her, and it looks like she's been seriously hurt by what happened, and it turns out to kind of all just be a dream and whatnot. But in any case, that moment of realization where she finally can triumph over whatever has been holding her back throughout the whole movie, throughout the whole book, she's able to achieve her ultimate goal, which, notice, she didn't do at the ordeal. At the ordeal, she faced the Wicked Witch, the villain of the story. But at the resurrection stage, she overcomes the greatest obstacle in her path. She achieves her final goal. I think that this is why Volger describes the resurrection rather than the ordeal as the climax of the story. Even though the ordeal is what he describes as the crisis, and it's the point where the hero faces off against the villain and faces death and whatnot, the resurrection is the point where it all comes together and the conflict of the story is resolved one way or the other. And then Star Wars, as I mentioned before in my video on the ordeal, has the Death Star. Their adventures on the Death Star, Christopher Volger describes as the ordeal. And then Luke Skywalker blowing up the Death Star at the end, he describes as the resurrection moment. So that one also fits the pattern of there being some time in between and some events that take place in between. But really, that one and The Wizard of Oz are the only ones that I can think of off of this list where those two are not all squashed together, though, with very little of a road back in between. So for instance, in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Harry faces off against Quirrell and Voldemort. He tries to protect the stone. That is very clearly the ordeal stage, where he's facing the bad guy and confronting potential death. There's a little bit of a road back in that he's rescued by Dumbledore and brought to the hospital wing and whatnot, and there is something of a resurrection. He wakes up in the hospital bed, he almost died, he finds out all of the things that he's been confused about or trying to find the answers to all year long, and then he wins a huge number of points for Gryffindor, and Gryffindor wins the House Cup, and that's Return with Elixir, but we'll get to that in a minute. In any case, there is that resurrection stage, but I feel like the road back you kind of miss because he's unconscious. Or similarly, in The Hunger Games, I would say that the ordeal is definitely the fight at the cornucopia against Cato and the Mutts, and Katniss and Peeta being left the only two surviving tributes. And I would say that probably the resurrection moment, oh gosh, hang on, is the resurrection moment where they pretend that they're going to eat the poison berries so that the Capitol will have to let them both win? Or is it when Katniss wakes up in the Capitol after the games are over? because I feel like the berries are kind of the emotional climax of the story. It's her making a decision that determines the outcome of the Hunger Games, and where she has finally learned what she needed to learn all along, which is how to defy the Capitol and get away with it, basically. But then the almost literal resurrection is when they're taken out of the arena and she's waking up and all of a sudden she's a Hunger Games victor. Either way, though, there's very little of a road back in between. All those things happen in very quick succession. The Lord of the Rings also, I would definitely say that the resurrection moment is when they destroy the One Ring. That has to be the emotional high point of the story, the climax, the point where everything comes together. It happens toward the end of the third book. I guess you could say that returning to the Shire is the road back, but I don't know of another climax that happens when they return to the Shire. I could be remembering wrong. It's been a long time since I read Lord of the Rings, and while I am currently rereading it, I'm only on the Two Towers at the moment. So is there something I'm missing in the Lord of the Rings example? If you have any ideas, feel free to leave a comment down below. After the resurrection stage, the final stage in Volger's hero's journey is called Return with Elixir. Now, the elixir doesn't have to be a literal elixir, and it doesn't even have to be a literal object. In fact, often it's kind of what lesson they learned, how they benefited from what happened, what they can bring back to the community that they're returning to. So it wouldn't necessarily be, it could be a literal elixir or a literal item of some kind that would be helpful, but it's actually, I think, more likely to be something a little more abstract. So for instance, Dorothy returns to Kansas and she brings back with her no ruby slippers, no witch's broom, none of that, but just the knowledge that this is home and that she doesn't actually want to leave it in the way that she thought she did at the beginning. And now she'll be able to be happy in her life in Kansas in a way that she wouldn't have if not for her adventures in Oz. At the end of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Harry attends the end-of-year feast. Dumbledore awards a lot of house points to Gryffindor because of what Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Neville did that night, and they win the House Cup. Now, compared to some of the later Harry Potter books, that is a very minor and insignificant reward for what they did. The one at the end of Deathly Hallows, for instance, is much more high stakes. They just won the battle that decided the outcome of the war. But in any case, it is still a return with Elixir moment in that the four of them, they've grown as people, they're not who they were at the beginning, and they have benefited from their adventure in a way that will now benefit their Hogwarts house and themselves in the future. The Hunger Games has a Return with Elixir stage as well. When they are going back to District 12, they are Hunger Games victors, so their lives will be forever different. Because of their Hunger Games victory, their district will actually benefit in some ways, and things are never going to be the same again. Star Wars, the first movie, has them being awarded literal medals after saving the rebellion from the Death Star. I would say that the third movie of the original trilogy also has a little bit of a Return with Elixir moment after the new Death Star is blown up and the Emperor is dead, and they're celebrating in the aftermath and whatnot, and it shows people all over the galaxy celebrating. If I remember right, in Lord of the Rings, it's actually kind of a bittersweet ending because Sauron is defeated and the world can be at peace, but the time of the elves is ending, they're going to leave, and everything will be different. And there's kind of a sense of a great age fading away or something. So that's still the Return with Elixir moment because what Aragorn and Frodo and the rest of them did will lead to everybody being safer and the world being, for a while at least, at peace. But it's not quite the same as, 11-year-old Harry Potter winning the House Cup for Gryffindor, is it? It's probably not a coincidence that Campbell in Hero with a Thousand Faces called his last stage the freedom to live. Because in all of those examples that I was just describing, basically what happens is that some great obstacle, some great threat has been overcome, and the characters are now free to live in peace. You have triumphed over whatever was threatening your peaceful world, and now you have the freedom to live in it. You see that very much at the end of the final Harry Potter with the platform 9 3/4, 19 years later thing. At the end of Return of the Jedi with the celebrations, although The Force Awakens and its sequels kind of dash the idea that there's a peaceful future after Palpatine is dead. Not so much at the end of the first Hunger Games because, yeah, there's a trilogy there and things are not okay after the first one. But after the third one, the future where they have kids and the world is at peace and everything. Oh yeah, freedom to live. And then I want to backtrack a little bit because I skipped the Master of Two Worlds, which is Campbell's equivalent of the resurrection stage for Volger. And basically what I wanted to say about this one is that I think Volger kind of reframed it in a moment of triumph against adversity, whereas I think Campbell focused very much on the idea of overcoming the obstacles in both the real world or the ordinary world and the world of adventure, and kind of becoming the master of two worlds, basically, able to deal with what comes to them in one or the other. I think that that is true. For example, her adventures in Oz help Dorothy to better accept and appreciate life in Kansas. But I think that that often gets kind of removed from modern stories in cases where the character doesn't necessarily go back to their ordinary world at the end. I talked a little bit about this in the Road Back video, where I said that in some cases they don't ever go back home, or if they do, it's temporary or very long delayed, not at the end of each hero's journey installment. So, for instance, Luke Skywalker eventually goes back to Tatooine, but it's in the third movie. He hasn't been there for a long time, and he doesn't stay there. Or Harry Potter, while he goes back to the Dursleys every summer, he chooses to live in the magical world as an adult. The last time that you see him, he's sending his kids off to Hogwarts. I think that it is true that we often see main characters that can kind of go back and forth between the two worlds, but I don't know if I would say that the climax of the story always results in them being the master of two worlds in the way that Campbell described it, because typically they choose one over the other. Either they're Dorothy choosing Kansas over Oz, or they're Harry Potter choosing the magical world over the Muggle world. However, there often is, like I said, some aspect of either having learned from one in order to have a better life in the other, or being able to kind of go back and forth between the two. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video series. I'm actually not done talking about the hero's journey, but I'm going to take a break from it in February. In February, I'm actually going to be looking at Jane Austen. I'm really excited to do that because I'm a big Jane Austen fan, and I've only made a couple of videos relating to her work so far, so I'm thrilled to have that in the pipeline. But then in March, I'm going to return to the hero's journey, and I'm going to look at the character archetypes that Christopher Volger describes in his book, The Writer's Journey. Those are the hero, the mentor, the ally, the herald, the threshold guardian, the trickster, the shapeshifter, and the shadow. I'm going to be making a video for each of those, and I really just can't wait to start talking about them. So if you haven't subscribed yet, feel free to subscribe so that you won't miss it.